The future of FEH and enemy phase is quite uncertain, although they could easily drop something that makes player phasing completely worthless, and then we get back into this perpetual cycle of tanking is too good, we need better nukes, nukes are too good, we need better tanks. I feel like that's just kind of how the game has always been, but something about having a bunch of free flare damage and ending turns, AoEs, and whatever else there might be just kind of rubs me the wrong way a bit more than, probably more now than almost any other time in FEH, from what I can remember at least. That being said, there's absolutely ways they could fix enemy phasing, but what if I said there's probably a way to just get that going right now? Because boy oh boy, if nobody else has brought it up, I'm going to bring it up to you. You know the best way of minimizing damage as a tank? Just not getting hit at all. Therefore, I suggest that we all go down the Vantage route, which is something that's already kind of finicky as is, but if I said that Vantage is probably the most consistent enemy phase strat we have right now, that would sound kind of sad because Vantage is also extremely inconsistent because there's plenty of counters they already got to it. And currently, Vantage usually works best when you have something like enemy phase Desperation, Brave, or something that has built-in Vantage with good enough gimmicks, or depending on their archetype, ways to charge up instant specials or piercing or whatever the case may be with something like Brave Marth or Winter Dimitri. But really, if you can't eat hits anyway, then why not just try something in the Vantage category? At the very least, you're doing more than just eating shit and dying. Although, of course, it doesn't always stop stuff such as Hardy Bearing, Flash, AoEs, which it will ultimately depend on the unit, of course, because some Vantage units also rely on the HP conditions, although that also goes out the window if there's flare damage, miracle, or even damage reduction. But I do think when Vantage works, it works amazingly. And here's a replay from my SDS run from this season, just as an example. The idea here is that I have Byleth, who has built-in Null Sea Disrupt and Supreme Heaven, which already gets around stuff like Flash or Sweep or anything of the sort, and has Piercing. And what makes the Piercing especially important for enemy phase strategies is that a lot of the time nukes don't have naturally high bulk, or they have relatively low defenses that can be taken advantage of if they do have to take a hit. But a lot of the times they could also run stuff like Remote Sparrow or Fleeting Echo, or just run any sort of support that gives them damage reduction properties, which isn't really that difficult to outsource as is. So in a fair amount of cases, you would absolutely want the ability to pierce through damage reduction, even if you aren't acting as a Vantage unit. It's just such an important effect at this point. But going back to the replay in Winter Byleth, with Vantage, Brave Lysithea and Brave Robin for support, so that way he could set up Vantage instantaneously, and he could always retaliate with an instant Supreme Heaven. And because I so happened to ban the team that had Hardy Bearing, there wasn't any realistic way a lot of these ranged threats could go in and attack without instantly dying. But again, it's not foolproof, because what if there was something that could shred through the team? That being said, I don't think most strategies are foolproof, because no matter what, there's always going to be a counter for something out there. And especially for something like enemy phase strategies where tanking is nearly non-existent for most units, I think your best bet at this point is to just try and go into a Vantage role. And as FEH continues to add skills and units that could benefit that role in particular, it becomes much easier to slap it on units that would have otherwise not been able to do it. Now granted, there are ways they could still buff the role so that even other units that don't have something like Desperation, Brave, or built-in Null Sea Disrupt could still function at a decent enough level so you're not just sitting there eating hits and immediately dying. For example, something that could easily be considered overpowered, although by this point I would highly debate it, would be the existence of a Null Counter Disrupt seal, Vantage seal, or them as statuses. We've already had a Vantage status from Winter Altina in the form of a button, but that only works in something like PvE or Abyssal maps, which, if I'm being honest for a second, is a complete meme anyway. You don't really need the button there, and you can't use it in something like Aether Raids unless you're somehow able to get rid of the structure. And even by that point, you still need other ways to get your special going and blah blah blah, and we do have a lot of stuff like that already. This doesn't necessarily apply to Winter Altina in particular, but for anybody that has something like Enemy Phase Brave or Desperation, they're already able to take advantage of a lot of stuff such as No Quarter or other piercing support, breath support, Brave Robin, and in particular with the ones with Desperation or Brave, they're going to be the ones that get around Miracle a lot more often than pretty much anybody else that's relying on one-shots, which is not always going to be a consistent thing anyway. That being said, they could always introduce ways for you to take hits in a much more consistent basis, so that way even if you miss a kill or you have to take a hit, or if both apply, then you're still able to get something out. And in my opinion, it's not something that's going to become so overpowered that it couldn't be countered anyway, because as is, there's already so many counters to these these types of strats anyway, whether that's Scowl, Miracle, AoEs, Flare damage, Hardy Bearing, flash or sweep effects, especially for units like Brave Marth. He could sit there in Vantage if he has it all set up, but the moment anything with Hardy Bearing comes along, he's just completely screwed. And that's not even just a Brave Marth issue in particular. That's pretty much every single Vantage unit that relies on trying to eat hits when we're in a meta where enemy phasing is just so inconsistent. And really, a lot of the time, these types of effects and skills are going to be affecting units that can only hit once anyway. Scowl prevents you from getting an instant special, which means you'll have a harder time draining their HP. Same thing with Miracle if you don't have any sort of way of getting around it, or if it's even built into the special, you just won't have the ability to get around it whatsoever. AoEs will ultimately depend if you have HP conditions. Units such as Shez and Harken, for example, have a lot of their effects tied behind HP threshold, so if they fall below a certain HP metric, then they're just not going to have it, and it ultimately eats away at their effectiveness, especially if it's really early into enemy phase strategies. And of course, you have Hardy Bearing and Flash effects, which even if you could get around Flash, Hardy Bearing is just something that shuts off everybody, which I think is honestly fine to have around. I don't think we need something like a null Hardy Bearing, because at that point it just becomes really ridiculous. I think having some sort of soft check like that, especially one that's easily accessible, is very useful for something that's both offensive and defensive in preventing one singular strategy from overtaking pretty much everything and shutting off the entire game. And even in a scenario where they would introduce some null Hardy Bearing or whatever the case might be to make Vantage strats super consistent, eventually they're just going to shut it down anyway. So I'd rather them introduce ways to buff it so that way it's more applicable towards more units without making it so dominant that they just ultimately shut it off entirely, and then we end up back in square one where enemy phasing is just incredibly inconsistent. And really, I think the best way of doing that is by not only buffing offense, but also buffing defense. I know, shocker, buffing defense makes defense better, but you can still introduce effects that allow units advantage at a much more consistent rate while introducing enough counters so that they can't just willy-nilly sit there and sweep the entire map for whatever the mode might be. You can introduce more offensive Scowl stuff in Miracle for the ones that rely on one-taps. You can introduce more stuff like Brave Robin or Sacred Seals or statuses that allow them to get through some effects with maybe some additive cost. We have Marth Emblem, which reduces your special damage by 8 points if you have Brave, which in some capacity is a nerf. They can easily introduce stuff like that if they want to keep some semblance of balance, but then again, it's IS and they decide to release this unit, so I don't really know what they really consider balance anymore. Maybe they could put Vantage on an Emblem, for example, or Null Sea Disrupt. Maybe have some sort of HP condition so it's not so free to the point where it's just completely brain dead. And while we definitely have units that can still shut off this strategy, there's also enough tools to where you could potentially shut off the threat from coming in and making it much more difficult for the strategy to go off. For example, something like Ninja Tsunaki on an Aether Raid's defense on Dark Season, where you could pretty much just run a gravity unit such as Loki or Valentine's Leo, makes her threat range completely minute by that point. And then after you just take her out in the player phase. They could also continue to combine skills like they've been doing for like who knows how long by this point. They keep introducing new skills and effects, and then skills that have both effects in them and then making them inheritable. Or if they want to keep going on the deep end, they can introduce another unit gimmick because we sure don't have enough of those already, and go from there. But no matter what, if you need a Vantage unit to succeed in this day and age, they're going to need damage output, they're going to need piercing, and in some scenarios, they're going to need a way to get around the Miracle. Even if it's not completely killing them in one hit, they're going to need to be able to eat a hit in retaliation if the situation calls for it. Although, even the Miracle stuff aside, my personal preference is that if they keep releasing tools for units that can function for Vantage roles, that they don't have these weapons or effects that are locked behind a 25% HP condition or any sort of HP condition. Because arguably for the longest time, that has always been one of the worst conditions you could have for somebody whose whole niche is having low HP. So maybe down the line they introduce some way to make it so you could get these effects going even if your HP condition can't be met. But if they had to focus on two things in particular, they need to make sure that your damage output for any Vantage unit is consistent even with the lack of Desperation or Brave, and they have some way to get around damage reduction, because that contributes to the first one in so many ways that you couldn't really function otherwise without it. But regardless, this is probably still going to be one of the next best approaches when it comes to enemy phasing, because if your unit is sitting there doing nothing anyway, they may as well be doing nothing in an effective manner. And in conclusion, The best way to survive in the enemy phase is not getting hit in the first place. Although that's easier said than done.